Today is November 27th, 2021, and I am Carter Tompkins Bishop. This is an interview I'm having with Warwick Tompkins, who is my mother's dad. Thank you for taking part in this interview with me today. And let's start with having you share your full name.
My name is Warwick Miller Tompkins Jr. Jr. is an unfortunate thing, and I very quickly got a nickname, which is Commodore. And most people call me that.
Why did your parents select this name for you?
I think it is meant to be in honor of the sire or some kind of family tradition. I don't really know. And everybody's dead, so we never will know.
When and where were you born?
I was born in Boston, 1932, February 26th, and moved aboard the schooner when I was about 2 weeks old.
How did your family come to live in Boston?
My father was operating a vessel which was very early in the charter game business in the Atlantic Basin, and it was wintertime, and the boat was moored in Boston, and I was born in a hospital near the dock.
What was the house like, or wherever you lived when you were little?
I was after the first 2 weeks, when I was in the hospital, I went aboard the schooner, and that was home until I was, I don't know, 15 or 16 or something.
What is your earliest childhood memory?
I remember being frightened aboard the schooner when I was 2 years old because it was the tension in the air. You know, my father's voice was altered. He was concerned and busy, even anxious perhaps. And the people with whom he was ordering in that situation. It was a very heavy storm in the south of Britain, and the schooner was badly damaged. So I was down below, the schooner was taking water, and I don't remember hearing the water down below, but it may very well have done so. It was tense. It was home.
Could you describe any of the personalities of your family members?
Yes, I could. My mother was born in Ranger, Texas, and she was a few years younger than her husband, my father. I don't remember the exact ages, but she was born in Ranger, raised there, and then she went away to Smith College, which is a very fine finishing school in the Northeast United States. It was at that time exclusively female. Now it's co-ed. She was gentle. She was a good cook and a superb hostess. She really liked looking after people. I mean, when you went to see Gwen, my mother, it was tea and crumpets, and it was the full 9 yards. It was really nice. My father was raised out in Troy, New York. I don't know where he was born, but probably there. Troy was at that time a sort of a manufacturing town on the Hudson River, upper reaches of the Hudson River, and his family had been agricultural. So he was exposed from the very early days in his life to mechanical, intellectual activity. And it stuck, and that's the way he was. In due course, he became an author, a photographer, a navigator, a very strong leader of men. And one of the things that impresses me most about him was that with almost no experience at all, he got into seafaring in Australia and taught himself everything, and ultimately had a great successful career with the schooner Longitude.
Did you have any favorite games or toys growing up?
I didn't have any special games of which I was aware, but I did have plenty of toys, lots of toys. And this wonderful family story that my father was aloft in the schooner in Boston Harbor. And he looked down and he saw a stream. The schooner was anchored out of the harbor. And so he was doing ship's work at the masthead. He looked down from the masthead and he saw a stream of objects floating astern, drifting away from the schooner. And he looked closely and he recognized the little wagon and a teddy bear and a ball variety of things. And pretty soon he realized they were my toys, Commodore's toys. And what had happened is that I had overheard adults talking about the need for space on the schooner, and I was trying to help out. I was shit canning a bunch of toys.
What was your favorite thing to do for fun aboard the boat?
Oh, that's really hard to say. The schooner is such a wonderful place to play. I mean, big wide decks to run around on. You can climb in the rigging. Occasionally, my father would rig up what we call a zip line today, a small one, and we played on that. He sometimes filled the small boats with seawater, so we had what amounted to a saltwater bathtub or swimming pool in the small boats on deck. But as a specific games, no, we didn't have that sort of thing. It was a different kind of a world. You got to remember, this is before 1940.
Well then, did you have any family chores or anything you had to do?
Yeah, we had plenty of chores. I beseeched my father and mother to have a dog, because all the children's books always have, the little boys have dogs. And so I was a little boy and I wanted to have a dog. So my father went ashore and got a dog. We already had cats, and I knew all about maintaining pets. You had to clean up the dirt box and all the rest of it. So he came back to the boat one day, came back to the schooner with a suitcase, and it was a little dog. And I don't know anything about the dog except it was small and brown. And it was scared really, really shitless, literally. And so it stayed on the boat. It was terrified. I mean, it had never been on anything except grass or dirt.
Yeah.
And there it was, striding around on planking. And it was hard for the dog. Anyway, the dog didn't last long, because it decided to empty its very disturbed bowels in the bow of the boat, and it did so on the deck. But unbeknownst to anybody, I don't think it would have made any difference to the dog, is my great friend Rufus, one of the carpenters on the schooner, was cleaning those seams. Seams were open. So the dog let go of a diarrhea load on deck, and I knew that it had to be cleaned up, so I got buckets of water and started sluicing down the deck without knowing that the seams were open. So poor old Rufus got all this on his head and his face, and it's too bad. The dog went ashore the next day. We have inside to store it. You can do this inside if you want.
Okay, let's see. What was school like for you as a child?
I have no memories of school other than my mother's teaching us, and they used something called a Calvert system, which it was a correspondence course, and the Calvert people, who were based in Chesapeake, I think Annapolis, used to send out all the material. They'd send out the reading material, the writing material, the pencils and papers, and instructions to the instructor. And so she did that until until I entered, I guess, grammar school at the 8th grade level. It was a wonderful system. We only studied for about 4 hours a day with this system, and it was very agreeable. One instructor and 2 students.
Do you remember having any favorite or least favorite subjects?
No. You should be aware of a man named Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz was an Austrian naturalist, and he became a Nobel laureate. He studied animals, and he was a student of a man who invented the word imprinting. Imprinting is the process by which nonverbal creatures teach their young. Ever wondered how birds know to fly away from human beings? It's because they've been imprinted by their elders. So it came to pass that this man Lorenz, in writing or researching for his most recent book, which was called On Aggression, was researching in Los Angeles, and we went to the Hacker Clinic where my father's second wife was working as a social worker. And Lorenz was interested in psychiatry. And they became friends. My father and Lorenz became fast friends immediately. This sometimes happens. If you're lucky, you'll experience it.
Yeah.
You know, so you meet somebody, it's just solid. Okay. So nothing would do, but Lorenz got invited to my parents' place out in the High Joshua Desert, Morongo Valley. And so they didn't know each other very well. But so the morning after they get there, it's a Saturday morning, my father was servicing the generator, which made the electricity, because it was homesteaded properly. And the two men were doing what men almost always do. They talk to each other, try to find out what's happening, you know, what they're like. Same kind of questions you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
He says, "Do you have any children?" My father says, "Yes, I have two, a son and a daughter." "Well, tell me about them." And so my father described his daughter, my sister, and he then launched into a description of me. And I'm quite sure, because Lorenz is such a great student of animal behavior, that he was aware of a descending note in my father's description. Because I was a great sailor, a really worldwide recognized seaman, but it never made any money. And in the society of the United States, if you don't make money, you're a failure. Almost always. Anyway, there was a descending note in my father's description of me. And Lorenz said, this is great, he said, "Your son had no choice. He was imprinted with seafaring from birth." So my favorite games, anything to do with the boat.
Well, once you were on land, did you attend any other schools or colleges?
But that didn't happen until grammar school. After the schooner stopped sailing in 41, I was 9.
Do you remember any favorite songs or music from when you were a child?
I had a couple of songs that I liked when I was entering public school, but I don't remember them right now. They were popular songs. My father used to play Elvira Rios on the schooner. At night, the schooner didn't have an engine vessel. When she was sailing at night, my father liked to bring a phonograph on deck. It's records, 78 RPM records, and he'd play music at night. It was heavenly. The schooner sailing along, quiet, the creak of the gear, and music. Well, Elvira Rios was a South American singer, and it turned out that she had something in common with Joan Baez. And the voices were similarly powerful. They're both females, obviously. But Joan Baez was my favorite as a youngster.
I forgot to ask this earlier, but this is just my question. When you were younger, were you aware of how dangerous it was to be sailing around Cape Horn?
No, I was not aware of how dangerous it was. You asked me in a different conversation if I was ever frightened. And the only time I was frightened was that when I was 2 years old. And that was in the schooner. The schooner was unlike any yacht you've ever seen. And you've seen a model of her, and she was heavily built, and she was a very able seagoing boat, and my father was a master mariner. And I had no fear at all. I'll tell you an anecdote, which might be germane. When we sail to Honolulu, you're in the trade winds, and the wind is blowing over the stern, and you're headed for Honolulu, and it gets to be warm and pleasant. And there's one of the indigenous things in the Pacific is that big rolling swell, long swells, because there's so much water. So my father used to lean on the rail up by the bow and watch the bow wave. And if you look at the model, you'll see exactly how that works. Mm-hmm. And on this particular occasion, there were headsails down in the netting in the bowsprit, which you'll also see in the model. And I was out there, age 11 maybe, something like that, and playing in the netting. And the schooner was pretty high, from my perspective as a little boy, the rail was pretty high above the water. I was always fascinated by the water. It's always moving past, and there it is, and you can't get to it. So I was out in the netting. My father was leaning on the rail. You know this story, do you, Gail? he's leaning on the rail like this, watching what I'm doing. And I grab the ratlins with both hands. Like this.
Yeah.
I'll show you the foot ropes later on the model. But I couldn't reach the water. So I let go with one hand. Because, you know, it shifts my shoulder and lowers my feet a little bit. And my father, without unfolding his arms, he said, "Son, I think you should carry on with two hands." So this should tell you something about the way our attitude was.
What world events had the most impact on you while you were growing up, if any?
The Second World War caused the schooner to stop sailing. And she had been tied up in 1941, and Pearl Harbor happened not long after. And so she was tied up indefinitely. And so cessation of activities aboard the schooner was pretty traumatic. And slowly, bit by bit, the schooner deteriorated. You know, wood rotted, decks leaked, things like that. And one occasion, our benefactor was a man named Herb Madden, and he had built a harbor at Sausalito, and Wanderbird was moored in that harbor. Storing a great big boat like that is expensive and awkward. There's not many places to do it. So Herb was our benefactor. He put us in his harbor. And for one reason or another, the schooner's sails were given to Herb Madden, and he used them as part of a landfill project. And my first awareness of this, I was coming home from grammar school, and I walked down the dock, and here was this pile of sails, which I recognized as Wanderbird sails. So I spent a couple hours crying on the sails, and went back to the schooner. So that was pretty traumatic. It was the Second World War.
Yeah. So, all of your early years were mainly spent aboard the boat. So, who were your friends, or do you remember your first friends, actually?
We had a Jamaican cook, no, Panamanian cook, and a Jamaican bosun, both black, and their friends, their children were friends of ours, but we only saw them occasionally. Mm-hmm. And on the schooner, we didn't have friends that way. And we were pretty isolated. We played with each other. My sister is 2 years older than I.
Could you describe a typical family dinner? Did you all eat together, or?
Well, we ate together when we were alongshore, yes, but at sea, you do watch and watch usually. Yeah. Wanderbird had a great long table, which is gimbaled, so the surface would stay horizontal when the ship heeled, and that's kept the food on the table unless the motion was really wild. But the galley was some 15, 18 feet further forward than the table, and all the food was prepared in the galley and then carried aft by somebody who, we shared work on the schooner. So if you were part of the crew, on every 5th or 6th or 7th day, you would have the galley chores. and you'd help clean, you'd carry dishes on and off the table, things just like that. And so that's where we dined.
How were holidays celebrated on board?
Well, I think my mother was probably responsible for celebrating Christmas, or doing most of it. We picked up a tree in Talcahuano during the Cape Horn passage, coming up the coast of Chile. And we had a decorated tree down below. My father writes about it, and he says the poor little tree was really tired because branches were doing this.
Who is the oldest relative you remember as a child?
My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, my father's mother. Her name was Thomas. She originally Tompkins, and then she married somebody named Thomas, and I was always very confused. Our cook always called her Mrs. Thomas, and I never understood. I just thought he had it wrong or something. But she remarried after the first husband. She was a Quaker, or had been a Quaker, I guess. And she lived in the Berkeley Hills, and she was a dominant woman, domineering even. And I think my father got some of his command manner from her, through her. Yes, she was the oldest person by far. She lived to 105, I think. And I took your mother over to see her one time. And I guess Gail at that time was maybe 6 or 7. And so here was this woman who was 100 years older than my daughter, approximately. And my grandmother goes, "These shouldn't chew gum." And your mother answered, "My babysitter says it's all right." There was no yielding, none, at that age or anything other age. Anyway, Gail, at that time, she concluded that she wanted to climb. It was a classic 4-poster bed with a lacy top and everything, just ancient, like something from a movie 200 years ago. So Gail, who was dressed in danskin tights, decided she wanted to climb a corner post on this bed, which is, from my perspective, knowing my history that you are learning about, it was wonderful. She wanted to climb. That's great. We are simians. We are all simians, like monkeys and orangutans and gorillas. We're all related, very close. So she wasn't having any luck, because I could tell, she didn't know this, but I could tell that she didn't get any friction between her legs and the bedposts. So I told her, take off your danskins, take off your tights. And it worked. She took off her tights and climbed in. So here's this elderly Quaker lady in bed with one of her great-grandchild climbing the bedposts. I mean, it's a horrific scene.
What stories have passed down to you, or have been passed down to you by your parents or grandparents, or even further down?
My mother tried to get me to get involved with her relations in Texas, and that was a flaming disaster. I went there when I was 18. I just couldn't stand it. And I guess I don't remember anything about them except I wanted to get away from them. I really don't remember anything about it at all. No, that's not quite correct. They had 2 paper bags in the place I was staying. They had 2 paper bags in the kitchen. One was full of wet garbage and one was full of dry garbage. And I was horrified. I mean, it's just isn't the way to do things. At least so I thought. That was an example. That's about all I remember. My father's mother, of course, it has been described, and she had the classic old house with lace, this, that, and the other thing. She had a great collection of carved or cast birds, some of which are in the house still. And she raised her children with an iron hand. I think my father was the eldest, and his next brother was Bar, and then there was a sister, and that was Laura, who was my great favorite. That was it, just the 3, I guess. and they were all very colorful. Barr became a librarian at the University of California at Berkeley, and a historian. He wrote a book himself, and he sailed in the schooner around Cape Horn with us. So, two brothers. I don't know how else to describe these people. The father was my grandmother used to put on Christmas parties, big Christmas parties. I mean, it was really very classic. And my father was called upon to play the piano. So everybody would be sort of on tenterhooks waiting in the kitchen. And you couldn't go into the front room where all the gifts were and the tree and decorations and stuff. So my father would play something on the piano and everybody would march in. Right? Well, my uncle was sitting in a chair. He was a very natty guy. This is my father's younger brother, Barr. And he smoked. So we're in this really posh house, everything is just right, big Persian rugs and all this stuff, sparkling crystal. So he had his knees crossed like this, and he was smoking a cigarette. And my father started playing the piano, so it's time to go, right? And a long ash fell off his cigarette. And he didn't know that he was being watched by me and my sister and my cousins. But he wore half Wellington boots, beautifully polished, crease in his trousers. And he carefully stood up and stepped on the ash, squished it into the rug. It was really a kick.
Wow.
Nice house. Are there any special heirlooms or photos that have been passed down in your family?
Yes. There's a painting on the wall of the schooner. And I happen to know a lot about that painting. There's a ship's bell hanging on my wall. You can photograph it if you want later. There's a ship's clock, which my father bought in 1933 or 4 in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And I have the document for that. It struck every hour of my life. Do you know how ship's bells work, Carter? Think about it.
Remind me.
Okay, well, here's the deal. You're going to go away to sea in 1850 or so. Nobody has a watch. But timekeeping is interesting or important because you want to share the work equally in time. And so the 4-hour watches, that was the traditional watch in seafaring, mainly from Britain. And in this history, and I don't know how it was in other places like, Pakistan or those islands. But so it was a 4-hour watch system. So the guys who were standing the watches didn't have any watch. So the watch officer had a sand glass. It was a half-hour sand glass. And he would turn the sand glass. That's one of his major duties, is to turn the glass. And when all the sand had run down, half an hour had gone by, he'd strike a bell. And the bell would resonate through the ship. 1/2 hour had expired. Okay? Obviously, the glass is turned over and the sand is still running. It's going up to the second half hour. And after the sand goes down the second time, he strikes bing, bing. And if you think about it, you'll hear that on the ship's clock. It gets subconscious. You don't hear it too much unless you pay attention. So every even hour is 2 strikes. Ding, 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 for 8 hours. 8 bells for a 4-hour watch. And so the watch officer would turn the glass, strike the bell, and the lookout would say, "All's well." That's the way they ran the old ships. So those are my most treasured memorabilia. There's another one in the wall in there. There's those 3 kittens. You may not have noticed them, but you should. They're one of my grandmother's things, and I guess they're 150 years old. But they're needlepoint with silk, and they're 3 little Persian kittens, and they're exquisite.
How is the world today different from when it was when you were a child?
Let me count the ways. I believe that in the United States, for reasons that I won't go into, a attitude or a sensation of fear has been promulgated, and people are frightened, and people are divided, and in this society now, particularly, they're frightened and they're angry. There is much more inequality than there used to be. When I was growing up, something like 40% of the working force in the United States was unionized, and now the number is 10%. So the working man doesn't have any voice, and so the working man is taken advantage of. That's what it's all about. That's the class struggle, which is a real thing. It's not taught in our schools. You've probably not been exposed to it much. But this kind of fear is another way of controlling people. And if you think about government, government makes the rules. I highly recommend that you seek out Robert Reich. He was the Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton, and he made a movie called Inequality for All. And it's addressing what is happening in our society, has been happening, and I think his movie is 10 years old now. But in it, he says, very tellingly, he says, the government makes the rules. The government makes the rules. And so the government is responsible for these changes that I'm describing. They're fundamentally responsible for it because they do make the rules. But there are people who are above the government, in my view, who are not part of the government. They're not elected, but they have enormous influence. And they're looking after themselves. They're not looking after the common man. So the common man is distressed, and he's nervous, he's angry, he's also angry. And so they do things like Columbine, they do things like shooting people. It's crazy, and it's literally insane. But I think we've been largely driven to it by the inequality. So make sure you look up Robert Reich. It's a good movie, it's a well done movie. You probably get it on Netflix or something. He was a big enough figure, so they won't censor it, I think. That wasn't the case when I was young. It used to have liberty. I used to walk to school and back in Sausalito. I don't want anybody to do that now. And for fear, I don't know that it's a real danger, but that doesn't happen. Kids get delivered here, there, and the other place by their parents, and that's very different. The whole sailing thing, which is my shtick, if you will, has changed somewhat, because when I was young and the schooner was sailing, there were still echoes of commercial sail, and today that's gone. There are no commercial sailboats any longer. I guess there's a few sailboats in the Chesapeake, and there are charter boats, but that's not the same thing. The commercial sail I'm talking about was cargo carriers, tea from Australia to China and stuff like that. Nothing like that anymore. So the sailboats that I knew when I was growing up had their roots in history. And today, while the roots still exist for the current yachts, they're all about racing, and it's all about speed and certain kinds of technology. That's a big difference, and I sense that a lot. I try to isolate myself as much as possible from the throng. I don't like the throng.
What do you think were your biggest accomplishments in sailing?
Well, when I was very young, I was 12 or 13 or 14 or something like that, I became aware of the fact that I was going to have to do something.
Yeah.
I guess that happens to all of us. And I didn't realize that I would stick with sailing at that stage, but I did. And I quoted Conrad Lorenz to you.
Mm-hmm.
He said I didn't have a chance. I mean, I was going to be a sailor, just no question about it. And maybe he was right. In any case, he was right, because that's what I did. Sailing was my thing. But at the same time, when I was 10 or 12 years old, I reckoned that it didn't matter whether you're a shoemaker, a seamstress, a fireman, or somebody that paves the roads. You had to do a good job. and you had to take your satisfaction from doing it well. And that's what I applied to sailing. You might be interested to know that I was in New Zealand a number of times in New Zealand, maybe a dozen times. And a friend of mine had dropped his job, bought a boat, and went sailing for 2 years with an infant child. And they came back. He wound up in the Bay of Islands, which is where I was at the time. And I was very impressed with his daring and, you know, just dropping everything and changing everything. And I asked him how he was doing that. His name was Ross Blackman. He shows up in the movie stuff. He said, "You really want to know? Well, get this book." So I did. The book was titled Think and Grow Rich. And so I read the book on the airplane on the way back to California. And I got about 3 chapters into it. And I realized that the technique that this guy was describing was almost exactly what I had done in the sailing sphere. And my conclusion was that had I applied those interests and energies in commerce, let's say, or economic activity, that I probably would have been rich. There's no way. I never finished the book. Are you getting what you want?
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
What do you think was your favorite place you've ever traveled to, or least favorite also?
Well, if you're a sailor and I'm a sailor, if your favorite place is affected very much by what kind of a harbor it is for the yacht you're on, or the vessel you're on. So it needs to be a protected place. It needs to be beautiful. It needs to be tranquil. And I say protected, it means you don't have to worry about other boats, other traffic, or hard weather. Or he wants to have a good holding ground for the anchor.
Yeah.
Which not many people would think about that, but it's a factor. So if all those things are true, you will like the place. So there's the geological beauty, the agreeable weather, the lack of crowds, the protected harbor, the depth, water depth, and so forth is a factor. Available to freshwater and stores. My favorite place in the world has always been Opanohu Bay in Moorea, which is about 15-20 miles northwest of Tahiti. It's just gorgeous there. I'm sure it's ruined now. I just heard from Jim Fryer, who's sailing there, that the good anchorage is so crowded you can't, and the manners and protocol there is not good these days, which is what happens, overcrowding.
Yeah. While sailing around the world, did you have any near-death experiences?
I haven't sailed around the world. No, I have not. No, 2 exceptions. I was sailing in the South Pacific with Nancy, and we were trying to get to an island called Aitutaki in the Cooks. And it was to windward, and it was squally weather, so the visibility wasn't particularly good. And I knew that I was on starboard tack, and I knew that I was going to have to tack on the port tack to get to Aitutaki. And for one reason or another, I tacked. What you have to know, Carter, is that in this part of the world, among these islands, these archipelagos, the land is, maybe maximum 10 feet high out of the water. There's maybe a 40-foot palm tree above that. You can't see them. And there are many parts of those islands which have no palm trees, so they're really low. In any case, I knew that we were going to have to tack from starboard to port to get to Aitutaki in this overcast. And it was blowing 15, I guess. Good, strong sailing breeze. And I tacked. And Nancy came up out of the hatch a few minutes later, 10 minutes later, and looked past me astern, and there was an island. One of these low, treacherous islands. We missed it close. It was close. And if I'd sailed on in the fog, who knows? I might have been able. One of the things you do in a sailboat, Carter, this is not part of what you're talking about here, is you read the water. If the water becomes radically different suddenly, you know something's happening, like the proximity of land, either from the bottom or from the sides. They call it cross sea. It's one of the terms for it. Anyway, the old navigators, the Polynesians, used that to navigate everywhere. And I was never been that astute, but I might well have seen these breakers before we got into them. That was one incident. So how close was it? I don't know, half a mile, something like that. And another occasion, there was a guy who lived right here, and he had come to the South Pacific to join me into Tahiti. And for reasons I don't understand, he went overland into Tahiti, which is the southwest end of the island of Tahiti. And I was going to meet him there. And of course, it's pretty remote. There's no navigational aids. And there are holes in these reefs, so you can get a boat through the hole. A pass, they call them. And so I was approaching the pass, and it was late, and the light had gone. And I thought I was at the right pass, but I wasn't. And I sailed in, heading onshore, and I recognized the sea pattern, and I turned away, and I was just outside the first break. It's quite close.
Transitioning this back into other aspects of your life, when and how did you meet your spouse?
Which one?
Anyone you want to talk about?
Well, I've been married 3 times, which you may not know. And the first time, I came back from basic training, and the schooner was laying in Sausalito, and there's a deck house. I went down to see my mother in the galley, which I described earlier, and she said, and I quote, "I have something for you in the deck house." So I went up there, and here was this very comely, hazel-eyed female, age 22 or 3. She'd been a model in New York City. And one thing led to another. We got married and stayed together for about a year. That was the first time. Her name was Evelyn. A flaming disaster. It was terrible. I mean, I won't go into all the details, but it was bad. How did I meet Janet? Oh, yeah. Janet was my second wife, and that's Gail's mother. Well, I had raced to Tahiti aboard a boat named Celebes, and Janet, this is really kind of a weird story. She had been a social worker in Berkeley, and she trained at the University of California, and she was a social worker. And so she used to, because she liked the water, I don't know why exactly, but she used to take her lunch, box lunch, and she'd go down and dangle her legs over the edge of the dock and eat her lunch. And because she had perfect skin and a good figure and beautiful hair, the harbor master, of course, noticed right away, and he got all interested in her. He gave her a book to read, which is one of my father's books. This is all in Berkeley. Okay, so he gave her a copy of 50 South, and then I guess a copy of Two Sailors as well. So she knew my history. And while she was hanging out at the harbor, one of the guys who was operating a boat, the boatkeeper guy, who was also destined to race to Tahiti, she caught his eye, and he said, "I will bring you home from Tahiti if you can get yourself down there." So she got herself down there. She hired a trip on the Thor's Isle, which is the only way to get, no airplanes in those days. So she gets to Tahiti, and there are 12 of us, I think, on Celebes, 12 men, and the boys, really. I was among the eldest. I was 24. And one of our members, here we are in Tahiti. You have to understand, Tahiti was a waypoint for the French legionnaires and expeditionary guys who were coming back from Vietnam at the time. And they'd stop in Tahiti, and they'd transmit all the sexual diseases in the world. So here we were, all these young men, testosterone going nuts, and we couldn't go out and do anything about it because you're sure to be infected.
Yeah.
So all of us were sitting down below in Celebes one day, and a member of our number takes his motor scooter, which he had rented, and he goes off to the gangplank of the Thor's Hall. Thor's Hall was her name, I think, to see what was happening. Just curiosity. And here comes this
raven-haired beauty down the gangplank. Well, you know, the real goods from the mainland,
Yeah.
probably not infected. You know, maybe we pay attention. So he offers her a ride to her lodgings, and when we talked to him later about this, he said, motor scooters are great. It's the only way you can get a complete stranger to put their arms around your waist. So that's how I met Janet. She came down to the boat, and she was working on the Vivica, which tied alongside Celebes. And she was abused by the people she was with. When she showed up, the guy who had invited her to come down there had the Vahini sitting in his lap, and she was annoyed with that. And he just shrugged his shoulders. He didn't care. And so she went to work. She didn't have any other way of going home other than the boats. So she went to work on Vivica, and we watched her and watched how isolated she was and how abused she was. And kind of took pity on her, and ultimately we asked her to sail with us, and she did. So she sailed home from Tahiti with us in Celebes. Tahiti to Honolulu to San Francisco in Celebes. And we lived in Sin for a little while and then got married. And then, that didn't work. But it took a while to completely fall. But usually the first 10 years are good. Any relationship, the first 10 years are great. If you can make it stretch great after that, you're doing well. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of understanding and sympathy. Anyway, that didn't work, so there was a divorce in the works, and I got this house, and Janet got the condominium in Richmond, and we went our separate ways. And by most standards, it was an extremely amicable separation. She's a good woman. She wasn't right for me, and I wasn't right for her. There are a lot of things that I won't go into. But along comes, I'm trying to think of how I met Nancy. Exactly how I met Nancy. Oh, yes. Yeah. There was a memorial ceremony in San Francisco for a friend of mine who died 20 years earlier. And so all of those people who knew him and knew the assembled people had saved the guest list, and they had a memorial ceremony 20 years after he died. And so I was there with a bunch of friends, and this guy was a fairly major figure. His name was George Kiscaden. And Nancy showed up with a girlfriend at this party. I didn't know her. And she had the big eye for Tom Wiley. She thought Tom Wiley was just about the best thing that ever came down the pipe. I mean, Tom was tall and handsome, and he had a beautiful daughter with him. He was being a single parent, and Nancy had a lot of sympathy for that. But Tom, for one reason or another, just wasn't interested. So here was this very comely woman, and with all her running lights on, and Tom didn't notice. And at the conclusion of this party, we were all invited to go to Lillian Kiscaden's house. That's the widow. But most of us had certainly I had enough of the whole Kiscaden thing by that time. We didn't want to go there. So we all rallied in Sausalito. We made an arrangement. This had taken place in San Francisco. So we all went to Sausalito to have dinner. And because Nancy's female roommate had been carrying on with my friend Jonathan in some fashion. I don't know what the fact. We called her the Hawaiian Squall. She had some pretty difficult temper tantrums. She did come from Hawaii. Anyway, she'd been carrying on with Jonathan. So these two women attended dinner with us in Sausalito. And Nancy was seated between me, I was on her right, and Robert was on her left. And she tells a story which she likes a lot. When she sat down, she says that each of us slid our business card in front of her. I don't remember doing that. But the critical part of that dinner party was that nobody knew Nancy. I mean, what's she like and what's she all about? And she said that she'd been fascinated by the way people handled sailboats on the bay, and she'd done some sailing as a kid. and she had been volunteering at the St. Francis Yacht Club, but she didn't know anything about sailing, and she was curious how boats were built and things. So Robert, good man that he was, he said, if you really want to know how a boat is built, you should go and see Commodore's boat. He's building one up in Sonoma. And so I said, yeah, what kind of a lead? It couldn't go better than that. So I said, well, if you're serious, tonight is a good night. I'm going to go up there and spend a couple hours and come back. And it's a good night because normally I would spend 10 or 12 hours. And if you want to see this thing, I'll give you a ride. So I did. That's how we met. She learned about all three of them.
Yeah. Look, Janet, why did you choose my mom's name, or if you chose, or how you guys agreed on that?
Well, we chose the name Aaron, as you may know. We wanted something which couldn't be easily abbreviated. That was the principal thing. Because I had a nickname.
Yeah.
And I didn't like being a junior. And it seemed to be the business of getting a nickname is undesirable. Let's say that. And so we chose Aaron. And she rejected it because not long after that she was in school and E.T. happened.
Oh.
Extraterrestrial. And so she was very unhappy with that. So she changed it to her middle name. When she was named Erin Gale Tompkins, the aforementioned Kiskadden said, "Sounds like a high wind in the Irish Sea to me." Well, that's where we had raced. He and I had raced there in the fast and race.
All right. If you could have had any other profession, what could it have been? If you even never thought of that.
I don't have a profession really. I'm a sailor. I'm a seaman. I like going to sea. I like managing boats and setting them up. I like leading people on them. I like teaching people about what I do and why it's fun. What profession? I started out to study physics when I went to Reed College, but that was a bust, a major bust. It would have been great. I mean, physics is a wonderful field, and it intrigues me today. You know, I'm reading Hawking and Kaku and stuff like that. I think if I'd had my druthers and my interests hadn't been so I'm thinking about watered down, and my interests were quite random and scattered. I don't think I could have studied to be a physicist. I took all kinds of aptitude tests when I was at Reed College, and before I went to Reed College, and all of them said I had very high quality spatial relations, which would have suggested an architect or something like that. And when I left Reed College in some disgrace. I wasn't doing well. And I attended University of California for a brief while, and I took some architectural courses. But just like the book that I told you about, Think and Grow Rich, I had a hard look at it, and I never would have lasted. I couldn't have lasted. So, ideally, probably be a physicist.
All right. Out of all of the things you've learned from your parents or throughout your life, what do you think is the most valuable?
To think, to be skeptical.
Nice.
That's what I
like
think is
that.
the most important thing. You need to think, and you need to have confidence, self-confidence.
It's important.
I think if you think properly, if you really get down to the nitty-gritty and grind it out, you will have self-confidence. And you don't, I think it's very important not to be too swayed by the public. You know, you gotta think it out for yourself. What really is happening with Trump and all these people that follow Trump? Think about it. And get right and learn about what happened early on. And don't just listen to the mainstream media, particularly that.
What is the one thing you most want people to remember about you?
I think that I thought, I studied, I was honest, all those things.
And before we wrap this up, is there anything you want to tell me, or any stories, or anything you just want to let out?
I'm not good at making them up, Carter, or sort of marshaling them and then parading them across the stage. I'm not good at that. If you ask the right questions, you'll get good stories. So you've asked some good questions, I think, and a few stories, the questions you've asked don't really bring them out. And a good interviewer, in my experience, and I've seen some of them on YouTube and movies, asks a question and they follow through. The responder says something, and then the questioner asks questions about that.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to do that. So what do I think? What do I want people to think about me? I want them to think I was honest, to know that I was honest, and that I wasn't greedy or selfish. Some people would say you're selfish to do what I've done, which is, I'm not making a lot of money for grandchildren. I'm not trying to hand money over to anybody, any kind of a fortune or anything else. I think the world of the intellect is the one that really excites me. And one of the things about sailing is it is very, very heady. As I mentioned, in the connection with Wanderbird and the Cape Horn trip, so you have to plan it, you have to understand it, you have to train yourself. And so it is a very, very definitely an intellectual process. It isn't just fresh air and sunshine. Self-reliance. Have you ever thought about this in your society, the society in which you live, or which I live? Your influence on what happens next to you or to your fellows is minimal, no matter what you want or what I want. You can't do much. On the boat, it's 100% different. What you want to do gets done, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
Think about it. Come up with other questions. I enjoy talking with you. It's nice to see you going the direction you're going.
Thank you.
Critical thinking.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, thank you for sitting down with me, and I think that's all we need.